Lady Amelia Ashford had grown up in the quiet countryside of England, where the air was filled with the scent of apple orchards in bloom and the soft hum of bees in the summer fields. She was the only daughter of Baron Ashford, a man of moderate fortune and steady honour, who valued learning and propriety more than ostentation. Within the walls of Ashford Manor, Amelia had been raised among books, music, and the ordered beauty of her mother's gardens. Though her family's wealth was not vast, their lineage was respectable enough to open doors in London society, and her father's careful stewardship had secured for her an upbringing both refined and sheltered. At 22, Amelia carried into her first season a freshness that many in London found both charming and remarkable. Her features were delicate, her complexion fair, her blue eyes luminous under the sweep of auburn curls that framed her face. She moved with a natural grace that had not been taught in the dance schools of the city, but born instead from long walks across meadows and a youth spent among the open fields. Her gowns, though not the most extravagant of the season, were always chosen with elegance and restraint, soft muslins and silks in pale hues that reflected her gentle character rather than sought to overpower it. Her accomplishments were of the kind society expected, but rarely valued as much as they claimed. She played the pianoforte with sensitivity, spoke French with ease, and read with an appetite for poetry and history alike. Yet what most distinguished her was not what could be listed in a ledger of talents, but the quiet manner in which she carried herself. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her words revealed intelligence softened by kindness. For this, she was admired, though sometimes underestimated, for the glittering society of London often mistook gentleness for weakness. The season of 1821 had already unfolded with its usual whirl of balls, assemblies, and endless introductions. Amelia had been presented with grace at court, guided by her mother's steady hand, and had found herself included in a circle of young women whose families were more powerful and whose fortunes were more expansive than her own. Yet despite the inevitable comparisons, Amelia's quiet composure had begun to draw its own share of attention. She was not the most dazzling beauty in the room, but she possessed something rarer, a sincerity that seemed to calm the air around her. It was this quality, perhaps, that had drawn the notice of Edmund, Duke of Wetherby. His name carried weight in every drawing-room of the capital, for he was not only a man of great fortune and title, but also one marked by the sombre distinction of loss. Widowed 3 years earlier, he was a figure both admired and feared, known for his strict reserve and an aloofness that discouraged even the boldest of hopeful mothers. At 35, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the authority of rank and the detachment of one who had set himself apart from the frivolity of society. Rumor painted him as unyielding, and yet the mere whisper of his attention was enough to ignite a storm of speculation. For weeks, Amelia had been made the subject of such whispers. She had danced twice in his presence, though never with him. She had been seen speaking to his sister in quiet conversation. She had once caught him glancing in her direction at a concert. From these small fragments, London drew vast conclusions. Ladies fanned themselves with secret delight at the prospect, while others, less charitable, spoke of her modest fortune as though it were a failing too great to be overlooked. Through it all, Amelia kept her composure, refusing to indulge either in reckless hope or defensive denial. She was too well bred to allow her name to be swept along by rumor, and yet her heart, against her will, had begun to quicken at the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, fate had turned its eyes upon her. Her parents, too, allowed themselves to imagine possibilities. Though Baron Ashford was cautious, his wife encouraged Amelia to see the season not as a gauntlet to be endured, but as an opportunity to secure both her own future and the family's standing. A union with the Duke of Wetherby was spoken of in hushed tones at home, never pressed upon Amelia, but always present in the air they breathed. Such a match was beyond what they might have expected for her, and yet London seemed intent on weaving the idea into every conversation. It was on the evening of Lady Godfrey's grand ball that the threads of speculation seemed ready to tie themselves into something more tangible. The ballroom was ablaze with light, chandeliers casting their golden glow across silk-draped walls and polished floors. The air was heavy with perfume, the rustle of gowns and the murmur of expectation. For Lady Godfrey's events were known not only for their splendor, but for the careful weaving of connections, and it was whispered that the Duke himself would make an appearance. Amelia dressed with her mother's attentive guidance, her gown chosen in a shade of ivory so pale it seemed to catch the candlelight. The fabric clung in graceful simplicity, its adornments few, for her beauty did not require excess. A single strand of pearls lay against her throat, a token from her late grandmother, and in her hair, auburn curls framed her face with soft, unstudied elegance. As she entered the ballroom, accompanied by her parents, the hum of conversation shifted ever so slightly, for her presence was already known, and her name already tied to the evening's most anticipated guest. She felt the weight of every gaze upon her, some curious, others appraising, and still others tinged with envy. Friends greeted her warmly, pressing her to join their circle, while more distant acquaintances offered polite nods, their eyes betraying curiosity as to how the night might unfold. The music swelled, couples moving across the polished floor, and Amelia allowed herself to be drawn into conversation, though her thoughts remained restless beneath her calm exterior. Time passed, the dances continued, and the anticipation in the room seemed to grow rather than diminish. Then, near the height of the evening, the great doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and Edmund, Duke of Wetherby, entered. His tall figure was unmistakable, his presence commanding, his attire severe in black and white, with none of the brighter colors or flourishes that other gentlemen allowed themselves. Conversations faltered at his appearance, fans paused mid-motion, and heads turned as though drawn by an invisible thread. Amelia felt her breath catch, her pulse quicken. Though she had seen him before, there was something altogether different in seeing him approach within the blaze of chandeliers, his steps measured, his gaze fixed with an intensity that seemed to silence the room. Her friends drew nearer, some with eager whispers, others with barely concealed smiles of envy, for it seemed plain that he was crossing the room with purpose. The music continued, the violins weaving their melody, but to Amelia, every sound blurred into the pounding of her own heart. He drew nearer still, the crowd parting instinctively, until at last his dark eyes met hers across the remaining distance. The air grew heavy, charged with unspoken anticipation. The murmurs of the guests swelled, for all believed they were about to witness a moment that would seal Amelia's fate and confirm the speculation that had long consumed London society. The music swelled, yet the air grew heavy, as if something unspoken lingered between them. The question remained, would the Duke approach her, or would London's whispers prove crueler than she imagined? The Duke's approach was slow and deliberate, his steps carrying the weight of authority that belonged to his station. The company parted with a kind of reverent caution, each guest careful not to stand in his way. The hum of voices subsided until the only sound seemed to be the glide of music from the orchestra and the soft rustle of gowns shifting aside. Amelia stood still, her breath caught in her throat, every nerve alert as his imposing figure advanced through the light of the chandeliers. The moment stretched with unbearable intensity. She was aware of her mother's hand pressing lightly against her arm, steadying her as though she feared Amelia might falter. Her father's posture stiffened beside her, his pride restrained by the knowledge that this encounter was taking place before the eyes of all London. Amelia's cheeks warmed, her heart trembled, but her gaze did not drop. She held herself as she had been taught since childhood, poised, composed, her head lifted with dignity, even as her heart swelled with uncertainty. When the Duke at last stood before her, silence claimed the circle of spectators that had gathered around them. His dark eyes, set in a face of stern distinction, met hers without the softness she had dared to hope for. There was no trace of the courtesy that custom required on such an occasion. Instead, his countenance was fixed, impenetrable, the lines about his mouth carved with resolution. For a fleeting instant, Amelia thought he might extend his hand and request the honor of her dance. She imagined the relief of the crowd, the triumphant whispers, the vindication of her family's name. But the thought was banished as quickly as it had formed, for instead of offering civility, the Duke allowed his voice to cut through the stillness of the ballroom, low in tone, yet so clear that no one present could mistake his words. "Lady Amelia Ashford will never be my wife." The declaration, though spoken without raised volume, carried with it the force of finality. It was not an aside, not a private murmur, but a statement pronounced with the coldness of iron, intended for all to hear. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. The fans of the ladies fluttered with sudden agitation, and the gentlemen shifted uneasily, their expressions masked but their curiosity sharpened. Amelia's body went rigid, her pulse crashing in her ears. Heat flooded her face, rising from her collar to the crown of her head, while her limbs trembled under the weight of every gaze fixed upon her. She could scarcely comprehend what had been said, the brutality of it, so at odds with the polished civility of the setting. The violins faltered for the briefest moment before the musicians, uncertain but disciplined, resumed their playing. The cheerful strains of the dance rang out, cruel in their indifference to the humiliation that had just unfolded. The Duke, having delivered his decree, did not linger to soften the blow, nor offer explanation. His figure turned with the same composure that had marked his approach, and he walked away without once glancing back. The void he left behind was filled at once by murmurs, some hushed, others bold, as those who had witnessed the exchange leaned close to one another with eager tongues. Amelia remained frozen in place. Her mother's fingers tightened around her arm, urging her to remain standing when her knees threatened to give way.
She forced her lips into stillness, though they quivered under the strain of suppressed emotion. Her father's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but he did not speak. He knew, as she did, that to react would be to fuel the scandal that was already igniting across the room. The crowd's whispers swelled like the tide. Some spoke in tones of shock at the Duke's cruelty, while others, less charitable, allowed sly satisfaction to color their words.
Fans half-concealed smirks, and sidelong glances pierced through Amelia with 1,000 unspoken judgments. Each second that passed seemed to brand her deeper with disgrace, as though the walls of the ballroom itself had absorbed the shame and reflected it back at her from every shining mirror and glittering candle. Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. The sound of laughter, subtle though it was, struck her like blows, mocking her naivety, mocking the possibility she had scarcely allowed herself to believe in. She had never presumed upon his attention, had never dared to speak of him as anything more than an admired figure of society, and yet in one brutal sentence he had stripped her of dignity before the assembled court. The remainder of the evening blurred into a haze of endurance. Friends approached with sympathetic eyes, but their pity stung as much as the cruelty of strangers. She answered what little was said to her with faint nods, her lips forming polite replies she could not remember, her thoughts consumed by the echo of his words. Her father made the earliest excuse possible, claiming fatigue, and the family withdrew before the dancing had ended. The journey home through the lamplit streets of London was carried out in silence. The rhythmic clatter of hooves upon cobblestones filled the void where conversation might have been. Amelia kept her face turned to the darkened window, her reflection pale against the glass, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mother's hand remained upon hers, steady and protective, but the gesture could not reach the hollow ache within her. When at last they entered the quiet of their own house, Amelia ascended to her chamber without a word. She removed her gloves with trembling hands, the fabric damp with the heat of her palms, and let them fall forgotten to the floor. The pearls at her throat seemed suddenly heavy, as though the small strand carried the weight of shame upon it. She sank into the chair beside her dressing table, staring at her reflection in the mirror as though she were gazing upon a stranger. The words repeated themselves in her mind with relentless cruelty. They had not been whispered in confidence or spoken in haste. They had been delivered with intention, with deliberation, and with the knowledge that all who mattered in society were present to hear them. Lady Amelia Ashford will never be my wife. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she willed them not to fall, clinging desperately to the fragments of composure that remained. She knew the city thrived on scandal, that by the following morning the story would pass from drawing room to drawing room, embroidered with speculation until it grew monstrous in its reach. Every smile would conceal judgment. Every glance would measure her worth against the wound inflicted upon her. The hours slipped by as the candles burned low. The clock struck midnight, then 1, then 2. Yet Amelia remained seated before the mirror, her thoughts caught in the snare of humiliation. She could not escape the memory of the ballroom, the light, the music, the sudden silence, and the piercing sound of his voice carrying across the assembly. It played in her mind with merciless clarity, as though time itself had frozen at that instant. The violins resumed their melody as though nothing had happened, but the girl at the center of the storm felt as though the floor itself might give way beneath her feet. How could she endure what the whole of London had just witnessed? The silence of her chamber pressed upon Amelia with a weight more oppressive than the crowded ballroom had been. She had escaped the blaze of chandeliers and the hum of voices, yet here, alone beneath the faint glow of 2 guttering candles, her humiliation grew sharper. The quiet allowed no distraction, and every detail of the evening replayed itself in merciless sequence. Her gloves lay crumpled upon the carpet where she had let them fall, pale fabric soiled by her trembling hands. The pearls at her throat were already removed, resting on the dressing table like relics from a life she could not believe had been hers only hours earlier. The ivory gown, once chosen with such hopeful care, now clung heavily to her as though it bore the weight of disgrace. She lowered herself onto the chair beside her bed, the bodice stiff against her ribs, her breath uneven, and pressed her hands to her face. Tears she had tried to withhold before her parents now broke free. They slipped down her cheeks unchecked, darkening the silk of her sleeves. Her shoulders shook as sobs overtook her, not loud, but desperate, the kind that spring from a wound too sudden and too deep to be borne in silence. She had never sought to stand at the center of London's gaze, and yet tonight she had been thrust there, not for admiration, but for ridicule. In her mind the scene unfolded again, the crowd parting, his figure advancing, her mother's steady hand at her arm. For one suspended instant, she had believed kindness might await her. But then the words had come, spoken with precision, words she could not expel no matter how she struggled against them. The sting was sharper than rejection alone, for it had been public, deliberate, a declaration meant to silence speculation and extinguish her hope with a single blow. The hours dragged, measured only by the steady tick of the clock on the mantel and the sigh of the wind against the shutters. At last she rose and paced the room, unable to sit still beneath the weight of her thoughts. She walked from the window, where the city lamps flickered faintly, to the mirror above the fireplace, where her own reflection startled her with its pallor and swollen eyes. She scarcely recognized herself. The girl who had entered Lady Godfrey's ballroom in ivory silk seemed a stranger to her now, someone too innocent to grasp the cruelty of the world. Sleep eluded her. Each time she closed her eyes, the music of the violins returned, mingled with the echo of his voice. The 2 sounds, so at odds, became a torment she could not escape. She pressed her palms against her ears as though she might banish them, but they remained. She sank once more into the chair, exhausted yet restless, her tears finally giving way to a hollow numbness. By morning, the first light seeping between the curtains revealed a face altered by grief. Her maid, entering softly to prepare her dressing table, cast her a glance of discreet pity, but said nothing. Amelia allowed herself to be dressed in a simple day gown of grey muslin, her movements mechanical, her mind elsewhere. She descended to breakfast with her parents, who waited in silence, their expressions grave. Her father unfolded the newspaper, but she knew before he spoke that the story had already taken root. Whispers did not remain confined to a ballroom. They traveled with merciless speed, and though the ink on the page did not name her directly, the lines were drawn too clearly to mistake. The rejection of a lady by a widowed duke had already become fodder for every household. Her mother, attempting to shield her, urged her to eat, but Amelia's appetite was gone, She stared at the plate before her, the hum of conversation reduced to a dull roar in her ears. Later that day, when she dared to step into the parlor, a visitor arrived with forced cheer. A family acquaintance, feigning casual conversation, made inquiries about Amelia's health while her eyes glittered with the eagerness of one gathering fresh scandal. Amelia responded politely, her words measured, though her heart burned. As soon as the caller departed, her composure shattered, and she retreated once more to her room, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. She began to understand that the ballroom had been only the beginning. The rejection was no longer hers alone to endure. It had been carried into every drawing room, repeated in hushed tones that grew sharper with every telling. She could not walk the streets without imagining the eyes of strangers upon her, nor sit at her window without fearing what words were spoken beyond her hearing. Even within her own home, the silence grew oppressive. She took to pacing the garden when weather allowed, seeking refuge in the familiar paths and the scent of roses. Yet even there, with the sunlight on her face, she could not escape the weight of her disgrace. Each step reminded her that her place in society had been altered. She was no longer simply Lady Amelia, daughter of a baron. She was the young woman whom the Duke of Wetherby had publicly vowed never to marry. In the solitude of her chamber at night, Amelia allowed herself to wonder what fault had been hers. Had her smile been too eager, her manner too modest, her presence too unremarkable to inspire him? She recalled her gowns, plain in comparison to others, her fortune modest beside theirs, and wondered if these had condemned her. Yet the cruelty of his declaration could not be explained by such matters alone. It had been more than a rejection. It had been a deliberate act of humiliation. Her heart recoiled from the memory, yet her mind returned to it again and again, searching for meaning where none could be found. Tears came and went, followed by moments of cold resolve, then by waves of despair. She had been taught that a lady's dignity lay in composure. But what composure could withstand such an open wound? She stood once more at her mirror, gazing into her own eyes as though seeking an answer. What remained for her now? Could she face another gathering? Another polite conversation that masked cruel amusement beneath its surface? The world beyond her chamber seemed at once too near and impossibly far. And she felt trapped within the walls of her own home, prisoner not of stone but of whispers. How could she return to the world with her head held high, when the very man who had wounded her was celebrated as noble and untouchable? Amelia remained withdrawn in the days that followed, her routine confined to her chamber and the garden paths that wound behind her family's house. The humiliation weighed upon her with each hour, pressing like a hand against her chest, steady and relentless. She could not escape the thought that all of London had seen her disgrace, and carried it now into their drawing rooms, where whispers multiplied like shadows at dusk. Every step beyond the walls felt impossible. Every thought of the world outside filled her with dread. It was her aunt, Lady Beatrice, who broke through that silence. She had arrived unannounced one afternoon, her carriage wheels crunching along the gravel drive as Amelia watched from her window. Beatrice was a woman of 50 years, her bearing upright, her expression one of practiced calm that only experience could teach. Widowhood had sharpened her insight rather than diminished her strength, and her tongue, though never cruel, carried the weight of truth. Amelia, reluctant to face even family, descended to the parlor at her mother's urging, where her aunt awaited her with eyes that missed nothing. The conversation did not begin with pity. Beatrice asked after Amelia's health, her meals, her sleep, each question spoken with quiet firmness. When Amelia answered hesitantly, her aunt regarded her with a steady gaze that seemed to reach beyond words. At last, when the silence grew long, Beatrice leaned forward, her hands clasped upon her lap, and spoke with the clarity of one who had seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize its pattern. "You are not diminished by another's cruelty," she said, her voice calm, unyielding. "Titles and declarations do not alter the worth of a woman. That hall was filled with mirrors and chandeliers, with faces eager for scandal. They will feed upon this for a time, but it will pass. And when it does, what remains of you will not be their whispers, but your own strength. Amelia's throat tightened. She tried to reply, but the words caught. Tears, which she had fought so fiercely to restrain, welled again and slipped down her cheeks. Beatrice did not chide her for them. Instead, she allowed the silence to hold, as though grief must be given its place before strength could follow. You cannot hide yourself away, her aunt continued after a time. If you surrender to their pity, you give them power. Return to what belongs to you, your books, your music, your walks. Let the city tire of its gossip, as it always does. Do not let the words of one man, however high his rank, define the whole of your life. The firmness of those words stirred something within Amelia, faint but real, like the first glimmer of light after a storm. She wiped her cheeks with unsteady hands, her breath uneven. The shame did not vanish, nor the wound, but a spark of rebellion flickered against the darkness that had consumed her. Perhaps she could rise, if only a little. Perhaps she need not remain prisoner to humiliation. Her aunt stayed with her through the afternoon, speaking not of society, but of ordinary comforts, of the roses beginning to open in the garden, of the steady turning of the seasons, of the constancy of small things when grandeur failed. Amelia listened, her heart still bruised, but the words settled in her like roots beginning to take hold in soil that had been barren. When at last Beatrice departed, Amelia remained at the window, watching the carriage roll away, the faint stirring of resolve echoing in her chest. That night, Amelia walked once more into the garden alone. The air was cool, the sky faintly silver with stars, and the scent of roses hung upon the breeze. She paused by a bed of blossoms, their petals pale in the moonlight, and allowed herself to breathe deeply. The humiliation of the ballroom still clung to her like a shadow, yet her aunt's voice lingered too, steady and insistent. Perhaps her life was not ended by a single evening. Perhaps she could step forward, even if only a single step at a time. Beatrice's words were still echoing when, the following morning, a letter arrived bearing an unexpected seal. The letter was delivered with the morning post, laid neatly upon the silver tray that the butler carried into the breakfast room. Amelia's father took up his correspondence with methodical care, while her mother unfolded hers with delicate fingers. Amelia had little expectation for herself. Few wrote to her now, save for those who cloaked curiosity in the guise of concern. But when the butler set a small, cream-colored envelope beside her plate, marked with a seal she did not at first recognize, her heart stirred with an unease she could not explain. She broke the seal slowly, the wax snapping under her thumb. The handwriting within was precise and elegant, its strokes measured, betraying a practiced hand. As she read, surprise overcame her. The invitation was from the Duchess of Harrow, sister to the very man who had humiliated her. The words were courteous, even warm, expressing a desire for Amelia's companionship during the summer months at Wetherby Hall in Yorkshire. The Duchess spoke of quiet walks, of the comfort of reading aloud in the evenings, of needing a lady's presence to brighten her stay. Amelia set the letter down, her hand trembling faintly. The irony of the invitation was not lost on her. To step into the household of the Duke of Wetherby, after all that had occurred, seemed impossible, almost cruel. And yet the Duchess's tone carried no hint of malice, no trace of society's ridicule. It was, if anything, an offer of refuge, far from the whispers of London. Her mother read the letter beside her, her brow furrowed in thought. "It is unexpected," she murmured, "but not unkind." Her father, more cautious, reminded them of the pain Amelia had endured at that family's hand. Yet when Lady Beatrice was consulted, her response was firm. "Go," she said, her voice steady. "Go and breathe different air. The city will only wound you further. Let the country give you rest, and let the world see that you are not broken." Amelia hesitated. To leave London felt like retreat, yet the thought of remaining among the relentless whispers was unbearable. She longed for quiet, for open skies and fields that stretched beyond the reach of gossip. The Duchess's invitation, however strange, seemed to hold that possibility. And so, with a mixture of dread and hope, she agreed. The journey north was long, the carriage wheels rolling steadily along roads that shifted from the bustle of the city to the wide, green expanses of the countryside. Amelia watched the changing scenery through the window, her thoughts restless. Villages with stone cottages and narrow lanes gave way to meadows flecked with wildflowers. The air grew cooler, fresher, carrying the scent of rain and earth. She felt the tightness in her chest ease, though it never quite vanished. At last, Wetherby Hall rose before her. The great house, built of weathered stone, stood upon a rise overlooking rolling fields and distant woods. Its facade was severe, yet dignified, marked by tall windows that reflected the afternoon light. Gardens spread out in ordered rows, their hedges clipped and their gravel paths gleaming. The house bore the gravity of age, the kind that spoke of lineage and endurance. The Duchess welcomed her warmly, her manner gracious without a trace of condescension. She led Amelia through the great hall with its tall ceilings and portraits of generations past, into chambers prepared with careful thought. Though the house was imposing, Amelia found the rooms chosen for her to be restful, their windows opening upon a view of green lawns and a distant orchard. It was during her first walk through the gardens that she encountered them, Clara and Henry, the Duke's children. Clara, a delicate girl of 9 with fair hair pulled neatly back, stood with a book clasped in her hands, while Henry, only 7, lingered close to her, his small face solemn. Their manners were polite but cautious, their eyes guarded with the grief that lingered after the loss of their mother. Amelia knelt to greet them, her voice soft, her smile tentative. At first they responded with reserve, answering her questions with brief words. Yet as the days passed, the stiffness gave way. Amelia read aloud to them beneath the shade of the great oak, her voice carrying through the summer air. She played simple tunes on the pianoforte in the drawing room. The children gathered near, their eyes brightening as they hummed along. She taught Clara how to press flowers between the pages of a book, and Henry how to trace the shapes of constellations in the night sky. Their affection grew quickly, innocent and unguarded. They began to follow her footsteps through the halls, to slip their small hands into hers as they walked, to seek her presence at meals and in the garden. The house, once subdued by grief, seemed to stir with new life in their laughter. Amelia herself felt something awaken within her, a tenderness that soothed her own wounded heart. In caring for the children, she found moments of peace, of purpose, that London's society could never give. Yet with each passing day, she became aware of a shadow that lingered. For sometimes, when the children's laughter rang across the garden, she would glance upward and find Edmund, Duke of Wetherby, watching from a distance. His gaze was steady, unreadable, his expression a mask that revealed nothing. He did not speak, nor did he intervene, but his presence was a constant reminder of the night that had scarred her. The halls of Wetherby grew brighter with the children's joy, but each time Amelia looked up, she felt the weight of Edmund's silent gaze, as though he wrestled with an unseen storm. By August, Wetherby Hall stirred with activity. The long stillness of the house, softened only by children's footsteps and Amelia's gentle presence, gave way to the commotion of arriving guests. Carriages rolled up the drive, their wheels crunching over gravel. Horses snorted in the stable yard. Trunks were carried across the threshold, and the air filled with voices, London voices, sharp and practiced, full of curiosity. The hunting season had drawn them to Yorkshire, and with them came the tide of society's expectations. Amelia had known the peace she enjoyed could not last forever. Yet the sudden return of faces from London unsettled her more deeply than she admitted. She recognized some among the new arrivals, men and women who had stood in Lady Godfrey's ballroom on the night of her disgrace. Their glances betrayed remembrance, and though they cloaked it in politeness, she could sense the stirrings of whispers waiting to be spoken. The Duchess, gracious as ever, guided her through the introductions with steady composure. Amelia, dressed simply in a gown of soft lavender, carried herself with quiet dignity. She kept her voice calm, her movements graceful, though inside her heart quickened at the murmurs that trailed after her. She saw the fans lift to conceal lips that whispered, saw the sharp glances exchanged between matrons and daughters alike. It was not open cruelty. No one dared display such boldness in the Duke's house. But it was there, all the same, lurking in the shadows of polite conversation. What unsettled her most was the presence of Edmund himself. She had seen him often these past weeks, always at a distance, his eyes lingering yet unreadable. Now, with the halls filled and the rooms bright with guests, his authority seemed even greater, his reserve more pronounced. When he entered a room, conversations shifted at once, voices lowering, attention fixing upon him. He was a man who required no words to command respect. One evening, as twilight fell and candles glowed across the long dining table, Amelia found herself seated among the company. The silver gleamed, the crystal sparkled, the air heavy with the aroma of roasted meats and fine wines. She listened to the murmur of voices around her, answering when spoken to, yet always aware of the eyes that drifted toward her. Clara and Henry, placed with their governess at the end of the table, glanced often in her direction, their affection clear even in such a formal setting. It was then that a remark, lightly spoken but cutting in its intent, pierced the air. A lady to Amelia's left, her smile too sweet to be sincere, observed with feigned casualness how dearly the Duke's children seemed to favor their new companion. The words, though framed as admiration, carried an edge sharp enough for all to hear. The implication was plain. Amelia's closeness to the children had already become the subject of conversation. The table stilled, the chatter faltering into silence. Every head turned, some with open curiosity, others with concealed anticipation. All eyes settled not upon Amelia, but upon Edmund at the head of the table. His expression was calm, his hand resting lightly upon the stem of his glass. The weight of expectation pressed upon him, for his response would shape the evening, perhaps the entire season to come. Amelia's breath caught. The memory of Lady Godfrey's ballroom flooded her, the hush, the eyes, the cruel finality of his words. Her hands trembled beneath the tablecloth, though she kept her posture steady. Would he speak again, as he had spoken then? Would he condemn her once more, before a room filled with eager witnesses? He placed down his glass with slow precision, and the silence that followed was sharper than any blade. Would he condemn her a second time, or would his pride falter beneath the scrutiny of his own house? The silence at the dining table seemed to stretch endlessly, the air charged with expectation. The Duke's hand lingered upon the stem of his glass, his dark gaze sweeping the length of the company. His features revealed nothing, no irritation, no amusement, no tenderness. Only the composure of a man who had mastered the art of restraint. At last, he inclined his head ever so slightly toward the lady who had spoken, his voice calm, measured, and without warmth. "The children have endured much," he said. "They are entitled to any comfort they may find." Nothing more followed. No rebuke, no defense, no mention of Amelia by name. Yet the words, though spare, carried enough weight to silence further remarks. Conversation resumed in cautious tones, the company aware that the Duke's pronouncement was not to be questioned. Still, beneath the resumption of chatter and the clink of silver against porcelain, the undercurrent of curiosity remained. Amelia, though spared from open humiliation, felt the sting of being spoken of as though she were not present. When the meal ended and the company withdrew to the drawing room, the whispers reignited in corners and clusters. Some speculated that Amelia's presence in the household must have purpose. Others declared that her gentleness toward the children was a mask for ambition. She heard her name slip from lips when backs were turned, saw the faint curl of smiles meant to suggest knowledge greater than truth. Each word, though not spoken directly to her, pressed upon her heart like stones added one by one to a burden already heavy. In the days that followed, the pressure within the hall grew. Edmund avoided direct encounters with her, his manner distant, though not unkind. Yet his silence too carried its own torment, for it left her without defense. Clara and Henry clung to her more fiercely than ever, their affection unguarded. They sought her presence from morning until night, slipping their hands into hers, calling for her to join their games, refusing lessons when she was absent. The strength of their attachment did not go unnoticed by the guests. It became fuel for their speculation, proof, so they believed, that Amelia had woven herself into the fabric of the household with calculated design. The gossip reached her ears in fragments, carried by half-heard conversations or the sympathetic glances of the Duchess. Some said she sought to ensnare the Duke through the children. Others whispered that her humiliation in London had driven her to seek redemption through ambition. Each word struck cruelly, for Amelia knew the truth of her heart, that she asked nothing, sought nothing, desired only to bring comfort where grief had left its mark. But society rarely cared for truth when scandal offered greater delight. Edmund himself was not untouched by the storm. Though he gave no sign before the company, those who knew him well saw the weight that pressed upon his brow. Alone in his study, he paced in silence, torn between the vow he had made to the memory of his late wife and the reality before him. His pride urged him to dismiss Amelia, to send her away and still the voices that threatened his household. Yet each time he resolved to do so, the sound of his children's laughter stilled his hand. For their joy, so long absent, had returned only through her presence. The tension grew until the household itself seemed to hold its breath. Guests lingered in the corridors with watchful eyes, their tongues ready to seize upon any hint of discord. The Duchess, dignified though troubled, sought to protect Amelia with her company, but even her presence could not shield the young woman from every glance and whisper. Amelia bore it with composure, her smile calm though her heart ached beneath the strain. It was in the midst of this turmoil that fate struck its cruelest blow. Clara, who had been bright and laughing only days before, was seized suddenly by illness. A fever gripped her, swift and unrelenting, her small body weakened by the heat that consumed her. The household was thrown into alarm. Physicians were summoned, remedies prepared, prayers whispered in every chamber. Through it all, Amelia remained at the child's side. She cooled her brow with damp cloths, held her hand through restless hours, and soothed her with soft words when delirium threatened. Henry hovered nearby, his eyes wide with fear, unwilling to leave his sister. The guests, who only days before had filled the halls with gossip, now watched in uneasy silence as Amelia devoted herself tirelessly to the child's care. The storm of speculation was silenced for the moment, replaced by the greater fear that death might steal what little joy the house had regained. And in the shadows of the sick room, Edmund himself appeared, his composure fractured by anguish, his eyes fixed upon the figure who kept vigil at his daughter's side. It was then, as the fever raged and the night deepened, that the truth he had long denied pressed upon him with a force he could no longer resist. The sick room had become the heart of the household, its stillness broken only by the crackle of the fire and the uneven breaths of the fevered child. Curtains were drawn to soften the light, and bowls of cool water stood ready upon a small table. Servants moved quietly, carrying fresh linens or preparing draughts prescribed by the physicians, but it was Amelia who remained constant. She had not left Clara's side since the first night the fever struck. She sat by the child's bed with a cloth in her hand, bathing her brow again and again, whispering words meant to soothe. When Clara stirred, restless and weak, Amelia's voice steadied her. When she drifted back into uneasy sleep, Amelia stayed close, her fingers lightly clasping the child's hand. Hours stretched into days, each one a blur of watchfulness and care, yet Amelia did not falter. Her gown grew wrinkled, her eyes heavy, but her resolve did not waver. Henry hovered at the foot of the bed, silent and pale. He watched every movement, every breath his sister drew. At times, Amelia gathered him into her arms, holding him close while his small body shook with unspoken fear. She told him gently that Clara would be well, though her own heart trembled with uncertainty. He clung to her words as though they were the only anchor in the storm. The Duke entered often, though never with ease. His presence filled the room with a tension Amelia felt even when her eyes did not meet his. He stood at the bedside, gazing down at his daughter, his face stern yet marked by anguish. At times he paced in silence, his hand pressed against the back of a chair. At others he lingered in the shadows, watching Amelia's every movement as though her tireless devotion unsettled and comforted him in equal measure. On the third night, when Clara's fever burned with unrelenting heat, Edmund spoke at last. His voice, low and hoarse, broke the silence that had reigned between them for so long. "You exhaust yourself," he said, his eyes fixed on Amelia's pale face. "You cannot continue without rest." She did not turn from the child, but her answer came with quiet steadiness. "I cannot leave her. She needs someone near." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment he said nothing. When Amelia glanced up at him, she found his gaze not cold as it had once been, but conflicted, as though a battle raged within him. The lines of his face, carved by pride and sorrow, softened under the weight of his fear. When the physicians came again, their expressions offered little reassurance. They spoke of waiting, of strength, of time. Edmund dismissed them with curt words, but his eyes betrayed despair. Alone once more in the room, he turned toward Amelia, his composure breaking. "I cannot lose her," he whispered, his voice raw. Amelia's heart ached at the sight of him. This man who had wounded her so deeply, yet now stood undone by grief. She reached for Clara's hand and pressed it gently between her own, her voice calm, though her tears brimmed. "She is strong," she said. "She will not leave you. We must keep faith." The hours crept forward with unbearable slowness. Amelia's head drooped at times, her body weary, but each time she roused herself, unwilling to surrender. Edmund remained near, his eyes fixed on his daughter, though often straying to Amelia as though drawn against his will. He saw the persistence with which she tended Clara, the tenderness with which she spoke, the patience that never faltered. At last, in the pale stillness before dawn, the fever broke. Clara's restless body stilled, her breathing eased, and a faint flush of color returned to her cheeks. Amelia felt the change at once. She pressed her hand to the child's brow, finding it cooler than it had been in days, and a sob of relief escaped her lips. She whispered Clara's name, and the girl stirred, opening her eyes weakly. Edmund fell to his knees at the bedside, his hand clasping his daughter's small one. His shoulders trembled with the force of his relief. He bent his head, silent, overcome, while Amelia brushed the damp curls from Clara's forehead with a trembling hand. Henry, who had been curled upon a chair in exhaustion, woke and rushed to the bed, his joy uncontainable as he cried out his sister's name. In that moment, the house itself seemed to breathe again. Servants whispered prayers of thanks, the Duchess wept quietly in the corridor, and Amelia, though weak from weariness, felt her heart lift. She had given every measure of her strength, and now, at last, there was hope. Later, when the child slept peacefully at last, Amelia stepped into the corridor, her body unsteady from exhaustion. Edmund followed, his footsteps heavy upon the floorboards. In the dim light of the sconces, he stopped before her, his face pale, his expression unguarded. "I owe you more than I can say," he began, his voice thick. "You have done what I could not. You have given back to me what I feared was lost forever." Amelia, her hands clasped before her, lowered her eyes. "I did only what any heart would compel," she said softly. But Edmund did not accept her modesty. His hand rose slightly, as though to reach for her, though he let it fall again. His breath was unsteady, his voice breaking with the weight of what he had long denied. "You are more than comfort to them," he said. "You are the light they cling to, and I—" His words faltered, his gaze searching hers with intensity. "I can no longer pretend that I am untouched. My vow has been my prison, but my heart." He stopped, struggling against the wall of pride and grief that had held him bound for years. Amelia's eyes, bright with tears, met his, her voice trembling. "To love again is not betrayal. The dead are honored by truth, not silence." The weight of her words struck him, and in the stillness of the corridor, the mask he had worn for so long slipped away. His eyes burned with a confession he could no longer hold back, his voice low, unsteady, and filled with the force of his surrender. He finally yielded, declaring what his pride had long resisted, his heart laid bare in the shadows of his own house. The autumn air arrived gently over Yorkshire, its touch cool upon the fields, its light softened by clouds drifting across pale skies. The fever had passed, and Clara regained her strength day by day. She walked once more through the gardens, Henry at her side, their laughter restored. Weatherby Hall, which had been hushed in sorrow and strained by whispers, seemed to breathe again. Servants carried out their duties with lighter steps. The Duchess moved through the rooms with quiet relief, and even the guests, though restless for entertainment, found their tongues stilled by the sight of the children's recovery. Amelia remained near them, her presence as natural now as the rhythm of the household. She guided Clara gently as the girl resumed her play, helped Henry with his letters by the window, and shared moments of peace with both when the evenings grew long. The bond between them was no longer that of guest and host's children, but something deeper, woven by trust and affection. They clung to her not only in gratitude for her care, but with the certainty of belonging. Their small hands reached for hers without hesitation. Their voices called for her with the intimacy of family. Edmund himself was changed. He still carried the gravity of his station, his bearing upright and reserved, yet something in him had softened. His eyes, once cold, lingered now with warmth. He no longer stood only in the shadows watching, but walked openly beside Amelia, his presence not as command, but as companion. Their words were few before others, yet within the stillness of shared moments, at Clara's bedside, in the hush of the library, upon the terrace at dusk, the truth between them had been spoken. The rumors of London had lost their power in the face of what the household had seen. Whispers that once carried malice faltered before the devotion Amelia had shown. Those who had accused her of ambition now fell silent, for ambition alone could not have kept vigil through fevered nights, nor brought light back to grieving children. What remained was not scandal, but quiet respect. It was in this new stillness that Edmund made his choice known. He did not summon guests, nor gather witnesses. Instead, in the presence of his sister, his children, and Amelia's own parents who had been called north, he asked for her hand. His words were plain, stripped of grandeur, yet filled with the weight of sincerity. He spoke not of duty, nor of lineage, but of love, of gratitude, of the life that had been restored to him through her. Amelia, with tears bright in her eyes, gave her answer with quiet certainty. She did not tremble, nor falter. What once had been humiliation was now redemption, and what once had been pity was now joy. Their wedding was held in the village church, a modest stone building that stood amidst autumn fields. The ceremony was simple, free from London's ostentation. The pews were filled with tenants, neighbors, and those who had known the weight of grief upon the household. There were no chandeliers, no gilded mirrors, only candles glowing softly against the walls and flowers gathered from the gardens placed upon the altar. Clara and Henry scattered petals along the aisle, their laughter ringing through the small church. When Amelia walked forward, her gown plain yet radiant in its simplicity, their eyes shone with pride. Edmund, waiting at the front, looked upon her with a steadiness that left no doubt of his devotion. Their vows were spoken without grandeur, yet each word carried the truth of hearts no longer bound by fear. When the service ended, and they stepped out into the autumn air, the fields stretched wide around them, golden with the turn of the season. Bells rang from the steeple, their sound mingling with the children's joyous cries. Hand in hand, Amelia and Edmund walked forward, not as duke and lady bound by expectation, but as husband and wife joined by love freely chosen. The days that followed brought peace to Wetherby Hall. The house, once marked by mourning, filled with music and laughter. The children ran freely through the corridors, no longer shadowed by loss. Amelia's presence at their side was not as guest but as mother, her tenderness weaving itself into every corner of their lives. Edmund, too, found his burdens lightened. The vow that had once imprisoned him gave way to a new promise, one born not of grief, but of love. No longer did Amelia shrink from the memory of the ballroom. The cruel words that had wounded her so deeply had lost their sting. They had been replaced by the sight of Clara's smile, by Henry's eager hand in hers, by Edmund's steady gaze that no longer hid behind pride. The past remained, but it no longer defined her. She had risen from its shadows into a life shaped by truth. As the season turned and the leaves fell across the grounds, the hall stood not as a monument to sorrow, but as a home alive with warmth. Within its walls, Amelia found not only her place as wife and mother, but her own freedom, a freedom born of dignity restored and love embraced. The quiet of the countryside seemed to echo the stillness in Amelia's heart, a stillness not of emptiness, but of peace. Each day at Wetherby Hall carried a new rhythm, a rhythm born not of grief, but of love. The mornings began with the sound of children's laughter, their voices filling the corridors like music. Clara and Henry, once so fragile in their sorrow, now danced freely through the gardens, their joy an unspoken testament to the healing that had taken root within the house. Amelia walked among them, her steps light, her presence natural. The children called her with the ease of those who knew no boundary between affection and certainty. They reached for her hand when they walked, nestled against her when they read, and clung to her with the unguarded love of children who had found in her what they feared was lost forever. Each glance from them carried gratitude, though unspoken, and Amelia felt in their closeness a calling greater than any title. Edmund, too, was changed. Where once his face bore only the shadow of loss, it now carried the strength of renewal. He no longer withdrew into silence, but sought Amelia's company with the openness of one who had laid down his armor. The lines of restraint that had bound him so tightly had softened, his gaze steady not in coldness, but in warmth. He walked beside her in the gardens, rode with her along the autumn lanes, and in quiet hours by the fire, their words flowed with the ease of two souls, no longer bound by pride or fear. One evening, as the dusk settled over the fields and the last of the light painted the sky in muted gold, Edmund led her into the library. The room, with its tall shelves and familiar scent of leather and paper, had long been his refuge. Now it was filled with the glow of the fire, casting warmth across the polished wood. He closed the door behind them, not with ceremony, but with the intimacy of a man who wished to speak truth without interruption. He stood before her, his expression solemn yet tender. "When I swore never to remarry," he said, his voice low, "I believed I honored the memory of what I had lost. I thought it fidelity, though in truth it was fear. I feared that to love again would diminish what had come before, and so I bound myself in silence. But in silence I brought only loneliness, to myself and to my children. It was you who showed me the difference between remembrance and imprisonment. You gave them laughter again, and you gave me back my heart." Amelia's eyes shone with tears, though her lips curved with a quiet smile. "The past cannot be undone," she said softly. "But love does not betray it. Love honors it by giving life where loss has taken. What you feared as betrayal is the truest fidelity, to cherish what was and still allow what is to bloom." He reached for her hand then, his fingers closing around hers with a reverence that made her breath catch. "I love you," he said, the words breaking free at last, unguarded, unashamed. "I loved you when you knelt at Clara's bedside, when you gave Henry hope, when you bore the whispers of society with a strength greater than mine. I love you not as a man clinging to the past, but as one who has finally learned to live again." Her tears spilled freely now, yet her voice did not falter. "And I love you," she answered, her heart steady. "I love you for your strength, even when it faltered. I love you for your children, who have become mine as surely as if they had always been. I love you for the courage it takes to lay down pride and choose truth. You wounded me once, but you have healed me more deeply. My life is yours, if you will have it." He drew her into his arms then, not with the cold restraint of a duke, but with the fierce tenderness of a man in love. The firelight flickered across their faces, the world outside forgotten, as though time itself had paused to witness what had at last been spoken. Their embrace held no grandeur, no audience, only the profound simplicity of two hearts uniting in honesty. The days that followed moved with quiet joy toward their wedding. It was not a spectacle of London, no crowded hall filled with jewels and glittering chandeliers. Instead, it was a gathering of simplicity, held in the small stone church of the village, where the fields stretched golden around them, and the air was crisp with autumn. Neighbors filled the pews, their faces warm with affection. Servants from the hall came with tears in their eyes, and the Duchess stood proudly at Edmund's side. Amelia's gown was plain white silk, her veil edged with lace that had belonged to her mother. She carried no jewels but the light in her eyes, and as she walked the aisle, Clara and Henry scattered petals before her, their smiles radiant, their joy uncontained. When she reached Edmund at the altar, she found his gaze waiting, steady and sure, his hand extended not as command, but as devotion. Their vows were spoken without grandeur, yet each word carried the weight of truth. He promised her not only his name but his heart. She promised him not only her love, but her constancy. The children, standing near, watched with eyes that glistened, as though they too understood the fullness of the moment. When at last the vows were sealed, the bells rang from the steeple, their sound mingling with the laughter of the children and the rustle of autumn leaves carried on the wind. They stepped out of the church as husband and wife, the fields stretching wide around them, the sky bright with the clarity of the season. No chandeliers blazed, no mirrors reflected their image, but the air itself seemed to rejoice. The petals beneath their feet, the hands of their children in theirs, the warmth of neighbors gathered to bless them. These were the treasures of their day. In the days that followed, Wetherby Hall was transformed not by new grandeur but by the spirit within it. The corridors, once hushed in mourning, filled with music and laughter. Clara and Henry, their hearts at peace, no longer clung in fear, but moved with the freedom of children secure in love. Amelia guided them with tenderness, her presence now as mother, not guest. Edmund walked beside her, no longer bound by grief, his heart unburdened at last. The house, once shadowed, became a home alive with light. Its great windows opened to fields golden with harvest, its halls echoed with the sound of joy. In every glance between husband and wife, in every smile of the children, the truth of their story was clear, that love had conquered pride, that dignity had risen from humiliation, that life had triumphed over silence. And so their tale became more than theirs alone, for it spoke to all who heard it, a reminder that pride may wound, but love heals, that loss may shadow, but hope endures, that to follow the heart is not weakness, but the truest form of strength. To you who listen now, let this be remembered. Courage is not found in silence, but in the choice to love even when wounded. Dignity is not lost in humiliation, but restored in truth. And the heart, though broken, can bloom again, bringing light where once there was only shadow. This is the promise of love, that it redeems, restores, and endures, not in grandeur, but in the quiet strength of two souls who choose each other, again and again. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.